I'm Leslie Sternlieb. I'm a longtime supporter of Women's Fund of Miami-Dade. I'm a Miami native. I live in New York now. And I've been an editor, a magazine editor. I've worked in the magazine world. I've worked in the museum world. I'm a photographer. I have roots in Miami that are still very dear to me. And I care about social justice. And Women's Fund was actually the first way that I felt I could make a big difference in my home community. My relationship with Women's Fund of Miami-Dade began way back, I would say in the mid 1990s. The first thing I did was attend a Women's Fund luncheon. I was invited by a then board member, and I had been to my share of social lunches. I worked at that time for Miami City Ballet. I was very involved with the arts community, and lunches are a part of that in terms of fundraising. And I thought, another one of those ladies' lunches, right? Well, it was not. It was the real deal. It was not a ladies' lunch. It was members of the community who had gathered together, members who cared, members who had the ability to have an impact. And it was quite real and very moving. And I thought, well, this is something I could really connect with. So I became a very small donor, what you would then call a member. And the more I saw, the more I engaged with the mission. And as my ability enabled me to support the Women's Fund more, I did. And I went from one luncheon to another, breakfast meetings, and I felt like my values were very much in parallel with the Women's Fund values. But there were a couple of ways that I drew close in a very significant way. There was one luncheon where many of the grantees had poster boards that had snapshots and captions and explained their mission and their work. And they had all been funded by Women's Fund. And I went up to the one for Art Spring. And I had been reviewing grant applications at that point, and I was familiar with Art Spring. And I was curious. I wanted to know more because, here's this small organization who worked with women in correctional institutions at that time in Broward and Dade counties. And I'm reading and I'm looking at the pictures, and Nikki said to me, she was the executive director, she said, why don't you come to a prison performance? And I thought, yeah, sure. And she said, well, we're having one pretty soon at Broward Correctional. But, I want you to know for security, because you're going inside of a prison, we need to have your driver's license and, like everything anybody would need to know who I am and who knows do what with. And she goes, we have to have this because you're going inside of a prison, but we're very secure about it. And I thought, okay. So I went to this prison performance at Broward Correctional, and it was a very profound experience. And we got to talk to the women, meet with the women afterwards. It was spoken word, it was dance, it was a variety of creative and dramatic and choreographic interpretations that the women themselves had created. And I got to talk to many of the inmates. And I thought, this is really important work. And it turned my head. And I decided because of that to become a volunteer facilitator at Homestead Correctional in Dade County, for the workshop having to do with women doing essays about their experiences and how they ended up in prison. And I got to know the women, and I got to see them as people and not prisoners. And I went into prison every week, every Monday for a semester. And I continued as a volunteer facilitator with other Inside Out programs. And because of that, I ended up joining the board. And I ended up being the president of the board not long after that. So it was very, very important for me to make this work happen. And it was because of the introduction of the Women's Fund. I think it's important for us to understand through stories what the impact of Women's Fund has been in the community at the individual and the group level. That's how I connect. I love the stories. I think one in particular that really, really stood out for me. It was at a luncheon, and there was a young lady from Liberty City Elementary, and she was part of a program that Women's Fund funded called Flowers. And it was an acronym, and I'm reading, it said, Future Ladies of Work, Empowerment, Responsibility, and Success. I had to write that down because that was a long time ago. Flowers happened in the early 2000s. It was for fourth graders, all girl fourth graders at Liberty City Elementary. And this young lady was at the luncheon as a guest speaker to tell us about it. And Flowers was not necessarily a mentoring program, but teachers took them on field trips. They took them places like the Miami Jewish Home and Hospital for the Aged to see how jobs might be available in caring positions, maybe as aides. Teachers checked their report cards. Other volunteer teachers got involved. They taught them about etiquette and manners and being good community citizens. And this young lady was there, and she was just amazing. She charmed all of us. She was dressed, I remembered, purple, and her hair was braided in pigtails. And she was in fourth grade and had such poise and charm and independence, but still a kid, like this sweet, charming kid. And what really, really stood out for me, and that I have never forgotten in 20 years, is that at my school, this young lady said, at my school, we call the girls flowers and the boys weeds. And everybody just cracked up. And, here's this kid just like telling it like it is. And the girls were flowers and the boys were weeds. And I never forgot that. That was 20 years ago. And, I could tell that this program really made a difference in her life. And she was proud to be a flower. All right, stop. I'm looking at the chat. I'm going to share another anecdote about how I became a member, one of the original members of donors who supported the endowment campaign. Again, there was a Women's Fund luncheon, and the guest speaker, I think it was Chris Gum from the Women's Funding Network, which is the umbrella organization of all the women's funds across the United States. And she was doing the pitch to start the endowment. And she said, I'm looking at this room, and you have enough money in this room to make this happen. You can do it. I can tell. And she said something about women in India giving away gold jewelry like bangle bracelets to do philanthropic work. And I thought, yeah, I'm looking at some serious jewelry in this room. And I might have had a couple of baubles on myself. And I thought, Leslie, you got to step up. Whatever you can do, you got to step up. It is your job to step up. And I did. So I became one of the original supporters of the endowment campaign. And of course, I continued to be a supporter. And my vision for the future is for the Women's Fund to go back to its grassroots. I think what really resonated with me is that Women's Fund was so grassroots oriented. It knew the needs and it knew how to fulfill the potential of so many women who had been left on the margins through the programming and the nature of the grant requests. The Women's Fund is close to the grassroots. There are so many larger granting organizations that can make great work happen, but there are a lot of small organizations out there that are really too small to qualify for their grants. And an organization like ArtSpring would never have been funded by a big granting organization until it got its legs, until it started to reach a certain level where it could qualify for larger grants. And Women's Fund is there to do that. ArtSpring was a promise that had a lot of potential, and it filled its potential because of the Women's Fund having faith in its potential. And I think that's really important. We've got small organizations that have great ideas, have great hopes. They know what the needs are. They know how to address those needs. And we've got to work with those groups, because from there, the impact grows and grows, and it reaches a lot of people who would not have been reached otherwise. I'd like to add that it's been a real privilege to work currently on the Grants Committee in the reformed version of the Women's Fund. It's 2022, and we're looking at systems, and we're doing it in a way that is very thoughtful, very methodical, but always keeping in mind the needs of very specific communities that have been overlooked. I'm really excited. I think the next step that we're taking is a natural outgrowth of where we've come from and our history, but it represents a new direction, but with the same tradition guiding it. And we've got great women who have been putting in a lot of time and a lot of hours and a lot of thought, offering their experience and insight. And I just think we're doing great, great stuff. And I think the community can join on and feel with great confidence that Women's Fund is leading the way in a new way, but still with the values and the mission intact, very much intact, from the Women's Fund that everybody knew and loved. So I feel really great about things. I also want to add one more thing. Women's Fund work doesn't just transform the lives of grantees and their communities. Women's Fund transforms the lives of women like me who have become involved. It was because of Women's Fund that I became introduced to ArtSpring. ArtSpring was a grassroots group that did expressive arts workshops for women in prison, did some work with youth at risk as well. But I was a facilitator, a volunteer facilitator with a writing workshop. And I'll never forget the first time I sat in the classroom at Homestead Correctional Institution in South Dade, very close to the Everglades, as it turns out. And there were 19 students, inmates, in this classroom. We were inside the prison gates. And I had always wanted to do something with my writing to give back to the community. So there I was. And I'm looking around, everybody's got their prison blues on, and, you know, here I am. And the first thing I thought is, my mother would plot if she saw me in this classroom. But the other thing that was really more compelling is I'm looking at all these women, and, you know, they were serving serious time, in many cases for serious crimes. It could have been having to do with drug trafficking or murder or serious felonies. And I looked at them and I thought, you know, if 19 women walked out of Publix, that would be my class. And being in that class, it was a great equalizer, because I learned to see them as people and not as prisoners. And, you know, I wouldn't want to be defined by the worst thing that I ever did in my life. And I offered that to them. And I listened with an open ear and an open heart. And I got to know them in a very human way. And it transformed me. And I will never be the same because of my experience with HerStory. I will never feel like there's that distance between me and someone who is incarcerated. We're the same people. We're all made in the image of God. And it was an elevating experience and a privilege to work with HerStory. And it was all because of Women's Fund opening that door for me.